She was sitting on the wet grass beside a tiny grave, reading a children's story out loud to no one. Nathan Calloway watched from behind an oak tree, 30 feet away, barely breathing. His maid, the woman who folded his towels without a sound, who moved through his mansion like a ghost, had driven 40 miles into rural Virginia every single Sunday for over a year, and he had never once asked where she went. The book in her hands was small and blue. Her voice was steady, soft, the way mothers read to children who were fighting sleep. But the child she was reading to wasn't sleeping. The headstone was barely 2 feet tall. The name carved into it was 5 letters long. And when Nathan finally stepped close enough to read the date underneath that name, his knees hit the earth before his mind caught up. Before we get into this one, where are you watching this video right now? Drop your city in the comments. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. The kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And trust me, do not skip ahead on this one. What he reads on that gravestone will break you. Let's get into it. 3 weeks before that morning at the cemetery, Nathan Calloway sat in the dining room of his estate in Richmond, Virginia, cutting into a breakfast he wouldn't finish. The fork scraped the plate. The sound echoed off walls that were too tall for one man. The Calloway estate, 11 rooms, 4 acres of sculpted garden, a wine cellar older than most marriages, had once belonged to his grandfather. Nathan had tripled its value. Hotels across the eastern seaboard, commercial real estate in D.C. and Charlotte, a development firm that had reshaped 2 downtown skylines. At 47, Nathan Calloway was worth more than most people could count, and he hadn't felt a single thing in 3 years. His wife, Helen, had died on a Tuesday. Ovarian cancer. He had been sitting in a board meeting in Norfolk when his phone buzzed with the call from the hospice nurse. By the time he reached her bedside, the room already smelled different. The flowers on the nightstand were still fresh, but the woman in the bed was gone. He never forgave himself for those missing hours. He never said it out loud either. He just stopped sleeping well, stopped eating full meals, stopped noticing the people who moved through his house. Grace Almeida was one of those people. She had worked at the estate for 2 years. Hired by Nathan's mother, Margaret, during one of the months when Nathan barely left his study. Grace arrived each morning at 6:15. She cleaned the kitchen counters before anyone woke. She folded linens with hospital corners so precise they looked machine-pressed. She watered the orchids in the hallway without being asked, replaced burnt-out bulbs before anyone noticed the dark, left fresh coffee on Nathan's desk at exactly 7:45. Black, no sugar, the cup always placed on the right side where his hand would reach without stretching. She moved through the mansion the way fog moves through a valley. Present everywhere. Noticed by no one. Nathan couldn't have told you her last name if someone had asked. Victoria Ashford, on the other hand, made sure everyone remembered hers. She had entered Nathan's life 8 months earlier at a fundraiser in Georgetown. Tall, immaculate, with cheekbones that caught the light and a voice calibrated to sound both tender and important. She was an interior designer with clients in McLean and Potomac. She wore silk blouses that cost more than Grace earned in a week and carried herself like a woman who had studied elegance the way surgeons study anatomy. She called Nathan darling in public and babe when they were alone, and she had already begun referring to the Calloway estate as our home in conversations with her friends. But there was something behind Victoria's polished smile that Nathan couldn't quite name. Something that flickered in her eyes when she looked at Grace. Not anger exactly, not jealousy, something colder, something patient. It started with the shoes. One Sunday morning, Nathan came downstairs earlier than usual. The house was quiet. Margaret was at church, Victoria was still in bed. The gardener didn't come on weekends. Nathan walked into the kitchen to pour himself coffee and stopped. Grace's work shoes, the flat, rubber-soled pair she wore every day, were sitting neatly by the back door. In their place, she had put on a different pair. Older, worn at the heels. The kind of shoes a woman keeps not because they're useful, but because they carry a memory. She was heading out the side entrance with a small bag over her shoulder and something tucked under her arm. He couldn't see what it was. She didn't look back. Her car, A 15-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked taillight pulled out of the service driveway and turned left toward the highway. Nathan watched from the kitchen window until the car disappeared behind the tree line. He didn't think much of it that first time. People had lives outside of work. It wasn't his business. But then it happened the next Sunday. And the Sunday after that. Always the same time, 8:30 in the morning. Always the same quiet exit through the side door. Always that same small bag. Always gone for exactly 3 hours. The third Sunday, Nathan asked Margaret about it over lunch. Does Grace take Sundays off? Margaret set down her fork slowly. She does. I gave her Sundays when I hired her. Why? Where does she go? His mother looked at him for a long moment. A look he couldn't quite read. I never asked, Nathan. Some questions are better left with the person who carries them. That answer should have been enough. For most people it would have been. But Nathan Calloway had built an empire by following questions that others left alone. And something about Grace's Sunday ritual, the precision of it, the silence around it, the way she changed her shoes as if she were crossing into a different life, had planted a hook in his chest that he couldn't pull out. The fourth Sunday he followed her. He kept 3 car lengths behind on Route 60 heading west out of Richmond. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray Virginia sky that presses down on the trees like a damp cloth. Grace's Civic moved steadily, never speeding, never hesitating, as if the route were stitched into her muscle memory. She passed through Powhatan, then Buckingham, then a stretch of road where the houses thinned and the fields opened up wide and flat under that heavy sky. The air smelled different out here. Wet earth, cut hay, something metallic from a distant creek. After 40 minutes, her car slowed. A gravel road appeared on the right, almost hidden behind a row of dogwood trees. She turned in. Nathan pulled over to the shoulder and waited, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his breath fogging the windshield. He didn't know yet what was waiting at the end of that gravel road. But something in his chest already did. The cemetery was small. No iron gates, no stone walls, no marble angels guarding the entrance. Just a low wooden fence, half swallowed by ivy, and a rusted sign that read Oak Hill Community Cemetery EST 1923. There couldn't have been more than 60 or 70 graves, most of them old, their headstones leaning like tired shoulders. Wildflowers had taken over the paths between the plots. The grass was tall in some places, neatly trimmed in others, as if only certain graves still had someone who cared enough to visit. Grace's Civic was parked under a sycamore tree near the far end of the lot. The engine was off. The driver's door was open, but she was already gone. Nathan stepped out of his car and stood at the edge of the fence for a full minute, listening. Birds whined through the sycamore leaves, and then a voice, soft, rhythmic, rising and falling with the cadence of someone reading aloud. He recognized it immediately. It was Grace's voice, but not the version he knew from the mansion. Not the quiet, clipped, careful voice that said, "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," and nothing more. This voice had warmth in it, tenderness, the kind of tenderness that lives only in one place in the human body, the place where a mother keeps her children. He followed the sound along a narrow path between the headstones, staying low behind a thick oak tree about 30 feet from where she sat. She was on the grass, cross-legged, her back straight, the small bag open beside her. In her hands was a book, small, blue, with a cover so worn the corners had gone white. She was reading from it slowly, pausing between sentences the way you do when you want every word to land. Nathan couldn't hear every word from where he stood, but he caught fragments. "Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night, stars." She was reading "Good night, moon" to a headstone. The grave in front of her was the smallest in the row. The stone was pale gray, no taller than a fire hydrant, with a simple curved top. There were fresh wildflowers in a glass jar at its base, hand-picked, not store-bought. A small toy car sat beside the jar, its red paint faded from months of sun and rain. Nathan moved 2 steps closer. His shoe cracked a dry branch. Grace didn't flinch. She kept reading, her voice steady, her fingers turning the pages with a gentleness that made his throat tighten. He leaned forward, squinting through the morning light, and read the headstone. Elijah James Almeida, beloved son. September 14, 2019 to March 3, 2025. You were the best part of every day. 5 years old. The boy had been 5 years old. Nathan's knees buckled. He caught himself on the oak tree, his palm pressing into the bark so hard it left a mark. His chest locked. His breath came in short, broken pulls. And behind his ribs, something that had been frozen for 3 years cracked. Not open, not yet, but enough to let the pain leak through. Grace turned the last page of the book, closed it gently, pressed it against her chest, and whispered something Nathan couldn't hear. Then she placed the book on the grass beside the headstone, rested her hand on the stone the way a mother rests her hand on a sleeping child's back, and stayed perfectly still. And Nathan stood behind that oak tree, a billionaire who owned 11 rooms and 4 acres and 2 skylines, and realized he had never once in 2 years looked at the woman who cleaned his house long enough to see that she was carrying the heaviest thing a human being can carry. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the door locked, his wife's silver watch turning slowly between his fingers, staring at the wall like a man trying to solve a problem that had no numbers in it. By Monday morning, he had made a decision that felt less like curiosity and more like obligation. He needed to understand the full weight of what Grace Almeida was carrying. Not just the grief, but everything beneath it. He called Martin Shore, a private investigator he'd used twice before for corporate matters. Discreet, thorough, no questions asked. Nathan gave him Grace's full name and nothing else. "I don't want surveillance," he said. "I want records. Employment, finances, medical, anything public. And Martin, no one hears about this. Not my partner, not my mother, not anyone." The file arrived Thursday evening in a sealed envelope. Nathan opened it at his desk with the study door closed and the lamp angled low. The first page was employment history. Grace Almeida, current employer, Callaway Estate, Richmond, Virginia. Position, housekeeper. Start date, March 2024. That much he knew. But the second line stopped him cold. Secondary employer, James River Commercial Cleaning Services. Position, night shift floor technician. Schedule, Monday through Saturday, 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. Nathan, read it again. Monday through Saturday, 9 at night until 2 in the morning. That meant Grace was working at his mansion from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, going home for 6 hours, and then cleaning office buildings until 2 in the morning. 5 hours of sleep, 6 days a week, for over a year. He turned the page. Medical billing records, all public filings attached to a debt consolidation case. The name at the top was Elijah James Almeida. The diagnosis was a line of medical language Nathan didn't fully understand, but the billing summary at the bottom needed no translation. Total outstanding balance, $187,342. Monthly payment plan, $1,140. Duration, 14 years remaining. 14 years. She would be paying for her dead son's medical bills for 14 more years. Nathan pressed his thumb and forefinger against his closed eyes until he saw white spots. The pages blurred. He flipped further. No life insurance policy. No savings account over $400. No family support listed anywhere. No cosigner on the debt. No legal aid. No charity applications filed. Nothing. Grace Almeida had buried her 5-year-old son, picked up a second job the same month, and started paying off a debt that would follow her into her 50s. And she had never once walked into Nathan's study, never knocked on his door, never written a letter, never asked a single person in that 11-room mansion for a single dollar of help. The file sat open on his desk for hours. Nathan didn't move. Somewhere downstairs, he could hear Grace finishing her shift, the soft click of a cabinet door closing, the faucet running for exactly 4 seconds, her footsteps crossing the kitchen tile toward the side entrance. Those footsteps sounded different now. Every single one of them carried a weight he had never bothered to hear. If the story is pulling you in, a quick like goes a long way. It helps more people find stories that truly matter. Victoria had been circling Grace for weeks the way a cat circles something it intends to break. Small comments. A wineglass left deliberately on the edge of a table so it would fall when Grace wiped the surface. A towel tossed onto a freshly mopped floor with a sigh that said more than any sentence could. She never yelled, that wasn't Victoria's style. Her cruelty was precise, architectural, built in layers so thin that no single act seemed worth reporting. But together they formed a wall that pressed against Grace from every side. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Victoria had invited 2 friends from her Georgetown circle for lunch at the estate. The dining room table was set with Margaret's heirloom china, plates that had survived 3 generations of Callaways. Grace had polished every piece that morning until her reflection stared back at her from the porcelain. The 3 women sat eating salads that Grace had prepared. Their laughter floated through the hallway in short, bright bursts that sounded expensive. Grace was clearing the sideboard when Victoria turned in her chair and looked at her the way a person looks at a stain on a wall they've been meaning to paint over. Grace, this vinaigrette is wrong. I told you lemon, not lime. How many times do I need to explain something before it stays in your head? Grace set the serving tray down gently. It is lemon, ma'am. I used the bottle from the top shelf. Don't correct me in front of my guests. Victoria's voice didn't rise. It sharpened. And while we're at it, Nathan and I have been talking about making some changes around here, refreshing the staff, bringing in people who understand how a home like this should actually run. I thought you should hear it from me first, since nobody else in this house seems to have the courage to tell you. The 2 friends exchanged glances. One of them looked down at her plate. The other picked up her wineglass and drank slowly, watching. Grace stood still for a moment. Her hands were at her sides, those hands that were always slightly raw, always working, always holding something. She looked at Victoria the way a woman looks at whether she's already survived 100 times before. Ma'am, I've cleaned homes since I was 19 years old. I've been corrected by people who paid me, people who didn't, and people who never learned my name. You can change the staff whenever you'd like. That's your right. But while I'm still standing in this house, I'm going to do my job the way I know how, quietly, completely, and without apology. She picked up the tray, turned, and walked out of the dining room without waiting for a response. Victoria's fork hovered in the air. Her smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes shifted. A flicker of something cold rearranging itself. One of her friends cleared her throat. The other reached for more bread. From the hallway, just outside the dining room door, Margaret Calloway stood with her hand pressed flat against the wall and her eyes closed. She had heard every word, and the expression on her face wasn't surprise. It was recognition, the look of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Margaret found Nathan in the garden that evening, sitting on the stone bench beside the fountain his grandfather had built. The water wasn't running. It hadn't worked in years. But Nathan still came here when his mind needed somewhere quiet to land. He was holding his phone, scrolling through nothing, the way people do when they're trying to outrun a thought. Margaret sat beside him without asking permission. She placed her hands in her lap, looked out at the dogwood trees lining the south wall of the estate, and waited. She had learned a long time ago that the best way to open a man like Nathan was silence. Push him and he locks. Sit with him and eventually the door finds its own handle. I know about Grace, Nathan said finally, without looking up. I followed her. I saw the cemetery. I saw the grave. He paused. Elijah. Her son's name was Elijah. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't turn her head. She nodded once. Slowly, the way a woman nods when she's confirming something she's carried alone for a very long time. I know, Nathan. He looked at her then. Really looked. You knew? How long? Since before I hired her. The fountain beside them dripped once from a crack in the basin. A single drop hitting the dry stone. Margaret reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Soft at the creases, opened and refolded so many times the ink had started to blur. She handed it to Nathan without explanation. It was a letter from Richmond General Hospital's Patient Advocacy Office, addressed to Grace Almeida, dated 18 months earlier. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, stripped of everything human. It confirmed that Elijah James Almeida had been discharged from pediatric intensive care on February 27, 2025, and had passed away at home on March 3, 2025. Cause of death: complications from autoimmune hemolytic anemia. It listed the outstanding balance. It offered a payment plan. It wished her well. "How did you get this?" Nathan's voice was barely a whisper. "She dropped it in the parking lot of the grocery store on Broad Street. I was behind her in line. She was buying rice and canned soup, nothing else. The letter fell out of her bag when she pulled out her wallet. I picked it up. I read it. And I followed her to her car to return it." Margaret's voice slowed. She was sitting in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel, not moving. The engine was off. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at anything. I knocked on her window, and she jumped like a woman who had forgotten that other people still existed in the world. Nathan stared at his mother. "That's why you hired her." "I hired her because I recognized that face, Nathan." Margaret's chin trembled for the first time. "It was the same face I saw in my own mirror the year we lost Catherine." Catherine. The name neither of them said out loud. Nathan's daughter, stillborn at 7 months, 12 years ago. Helen had carried that loss in her body. Margaret had carried it in her silence. Nathan had carried it nowhere, because he had sealed it so deep inside himself that most days he forgot it had ever existed. "Grace doesn't know I read that letter," Margaret continued quietly. "She thinks I hired her from an agency listing, and I never told her about Catherine. Some grief doesn't need company, Nathan. It just needs a roof and a paycheck and someone who doesn't ask questions at 6 in the morning." The garden was dark now. The dogwood leaves rustled in a breeze that smelled like rain. Nathan folded the letter along its old creases and held it against his chest, the same way he had once seen Grace hold that small blue book against hers at the cemetery. 2 mothers, 2 children, 2 graves that would never grow flowers tall enough to be seen from the road. And between them, a silence that had held more love than most conversations ever would. Nathan might never have discovered the truth about Dennis Holt if it hadn't been for a manila envelope that arrived at the estate on a Friday morning with no return address. Grace had placed it on his desk with the rest of the mail, aligned neatly beside his coffee cup the way she always did. Edges parallel, stamps facing up. She hadn't opened it. She never opened his mail. But something about the weight of it, the thickness, the way the flap had been sealed with tape instead of adhesive, made Nathan pause before reaching for anything else. Inside were bank statements, 12 months of them. The account belonged to a company Nathan had never heard of, Ashford Creative Holdings, LLC. The name hit him in 2 places at once. Ashford, Victoria's last name. Holdings, the kind of word Dennis used when he was moving money between accounts that weren't supposed to touch. Nathan spread the pages across his desk. The transfers were methodical, small enough to avoid automatic flags, large enough to matter. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. 12,000 wired on the same day Nathan had signed the Q3 operating budget without reviewing the line items because Dennis had told him everything was clean. The money flowed from Callaway Group's discretionary fund into Ashford Creative Holdings with the regularity of a heartbeat. Over 12 months, the total exceeded $340,000. Nathan's hands didn't shake. His jaw tightened. His breathing stayed even. But something behind his eyes went very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a man decides to stop being blind on purpose. He called Martin Shore. "I need everything on Ashford Creative Holdings. Formation documents, signatories, bank records, the full picture. And I need you to pull Dennis Holt's personal financials for the last 18 months. Whatever you can access legally. I want it by Monday." The file arrived Sunday night. It confirmed what the envelope had whispered. Dennis Holt and Victoria Ashford had incorporated the company together 11 days after Victoria's first dinner at the Callaway estate. Dennis was the registered agent. Victoria was the sole beneficiary. The operating agreement, buried in the appendix, described the company's purpose in language so vague it could mean anything: consulting, creative services, brand development. But the money trail told a cleaner story. Every dollar that left Callaway Group ended up in an account Victoria controlled. Nathan sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Dennis, The man who had stood beside him at Helen's funeral. The man who had driven him home from the hospital after the accident that nearly took Margaret's life. The man who called him brother and meant it, or so Nathan had believed for 22 years. He thought about Grace, a woman drowning in $187,000 of debt who had never taken a single thing that wasn't hers. And then he thought about Dennis, a man who had everything: salary, equity, trust, access, and had reached into Nathan's pocket anyway, not because he needed it but because he could. The contrast sat in Nathan's chest like a stone swallowed whole. He didn't confront Dennis that night. He didn't call Victoria. He closed the file, locked it in the bottom drawer of his desk, and sat in the dark study listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere below, the side door clicked shut. Grace leaving for her second shift, walking out into the night toward 5 more hours of work, carrying everything alone. Nathan pressed his palms together and whispered to no one, "How did I get every single thing backwards?" The Callaway Foundation's annual charity gala was held on the first Saturday of October at the Richmond Grand, a hotel Nathan's company had built 7 years earlier, for 100 guests, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, waitstaff moving between tables like shadows in white gloves. The kind of evening where everyone smiled and no one said anything real. Nathan had planned this night for 2 weeks with the precision of a man building a case. Tomas Vidal, the family attorney, had prepared the legal documents. Martin Shore had organized the evidence into a single bound folder. Margaret had made one phone call to Clara, the elderly cemetery caretaker, who had agreed to attend as a guest and sit in the 3rd row. Victoria arrived in emerald silk, her arm linked through Dennis's elbow as they entered together. A gesture so casual, so practiced, that Nathan realized they had stopped pretending long before he had started paying attention. She kissed Nathan on the cheek at the head table, called him darling, and adjusted his tie with fingers that had been signing his money away for a year. Dennis shook Nathan's hand with both palms. "Big night, brother. You ready?" "More than you know," Nathan said. The speeches began at 9. A hospital director talked about funding. A city councilwoman discussed housing initiatives. Polite applause, polite smiles, and then Nathan wheeled himself to the podium. He didn't start with the foundation. He didn't start with numbers. He reached beneath the podium and placed a small blue book on the lectern. Its cover faded, its spine cracked, its pages soft from being held too many times. "This book is called Goodnight Moon," he said. "Most of you read it to your children. Some of you had it read to you. It costs $8 at any bookstore in this city. And it is the most valuable object I have ever held in my life." The room went quiet. Victoria's smile thinned by a degree. "There is a woman in this room tonight who reads this book every Sunday, not to a living child, but to a gravestone. Her son died at 5 years old from a disease she couldn't afford to treat. She owes $187,000 in hospital bills. She works 2 jobs, one of them in my house, one of them cleaning office floors until 2 in the morning. She has never asked anyone for help. Not once. Not $1. Not one word." He paused. "I want her to come up here and say something, because I think this room needs to hear a voice it's never listened to before." Grace was standing near the back wall in a simple black dress Margaret had given her that afternoon. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her eyes were wide. She shook her head once, barely visible. Nathan held her gaze and nodded. Not a command, a request. The room turned. 400 faces found her at once. She walked to the podium the way she walked through every room she had ever cleaned. Quietly, without rushing, without apology. She stood beside Nathan, looked out at the chandeliers and the crystal and the silk, and spoke. "I'm not used to being on this side of the room. I'm usually the one refilling your water glasses, picking up your napkins, clearing your plates before you notice they're gone. Women like me, we move through rooms like this every day. We see everything. We hear everything. We know which couples are pretending. We know which smiles are real. We know who tips and who doesn't. We know who looks at us and who looks through us." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It carried. "My son's name was Elijah. He was 5. He liked red cars and pancakes and being read to before bed. He died because I couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved him. Not because the treatment didn't exist, it existed. It was in a building 12 miles from our apartment. But 12 miles means nothing when the door has a price tag you'll never reach. She placed her hand on the blue book. Every Sunday, I drive to his grave and I read him this book. The same book. The same pages. Because it was the last story I ever read to him, and I promised him I wouldn't stop. You keep your promises to your children even when they can't hear you anymore. Especially when they can't hear you anymore. The room was silent. A woman in the second row pressed a napkin to her eyes. A man at the far table set down his glass and didn't pick it up again. Nathan turned to the room. Now let me tell you about the people in this room who had everything and still reached into pockets that didn't belong to them. He opened the folder. He read the company name, Ashford Creative Holdings. He read the transfers. He read the dates. He read Dennis Holt's name as registered agent and Victoria Ashford's name as sole beneficiary. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers did the screaming. Victoria stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. Dennis grabbed her arm, not to comfort her, to stop her from running. The room watched them the way an audience watches the final act of something they always knew was coming but hoped they were wrong about. A woman who has nothing never took a thing, Nathan said, his voice steady and low. And two people who had everything stole from the man who trusted them most. I'll let this room decide which story deserves applause. The applause started from Clara, the elderly cemetery caretaker in the third row. A single pair of weathered hands clapping slowly. Then the second row. Then the fourth. Then the whole room, rising to its feet. Not for Nathan. Not for the foundation. But for the woman standing beside the podium with a small blue book pressed against her chest and tears rolling silently down her face. Dennis Holt was arrested in the parking lot of the Richmond Grand before his car reached the exit gate. Two plainclothes officers from the Financial Crimes Division were waiting beside his sedan with a warrant signed that afternoon. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He handed over his keys the way a man hands over something he always knew wasn't really his. Victoria was detained inside the hotel lobby. Still in her emerald silk. Still wearing the earrings she had bought with money that belonged to a man she had never loved. Tomas Vidal filed the civil suit the following Monday. The criminal charges followed within the week. Nathan didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. He sat in his study that night with the bound folder closed on his desk and the small blue book open beside it. He had asked Grace if he could borrow it. Just for the night. She had handed it to him without hesitation. The way a mother hands someone the most sacred thing she owns when she finally trusts them enough to hold it. He read it once, cover to cover. $8, 32 pages. And every word felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. The next morning, Nathan called Richmond General Hospital's billing department. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. By the end of it, the outstanding balance of $187,342 on the account of Elijah James Almeida had been paid in full. He asked that no notification be sent to Grace. He didn't want her to know, not yet. Some debts are not erased for gratitude. They are erased because they should never have existed in the first place. Margaret told her anyway, not with words, with a single gesture. She walked into the kitchen the following morning, took Grace's hands in hers, and held them. Just held them. Grace looked at her, confused at first, and then something shifted across her face. A crack in the stillness she had carried for 18 months. She didn't cry. She sat down on the kitchen chair slowly, placed both palms flat on the table, and breathed, one long, shaking breath. The kind that comes when a woman finally sets down a weight she had forgotten she was allowed to put down. 3 months later, the Elijah James Almeida Foundation opened its doors in downtown Richmond, a pediatric assistance fund for families facing medical debt they could not survive alone. Grace sat on the board. Margaret sat beside her. Nathan provided the funding but kept his name off the letterhead. The foundation's logo was a small blue book, open to the last page. On the shelf in Nathan's study, between a photograph of Helen and the silver watch he still wore every day, sat a copy of Goodnight Moon. Not closed, not shelved spine out the way books are stored when they're finished. It was open, standing upright. Turned to the final page, the page Grace had read to Elijah every night, the page she still read to him every Sunday on the wet grass of a cemetery in rural Virginia. Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. Some books never close. Some stories never end. And some women, quiet women, invisible women, women who change their shoes by the back door and drive 40 miles every Sunday carrying nothing but a bag and a memory, hold the entire world together without anyone noticing until the moment someone finally sits still long enough to listen. Nathan Calloway listened. And he was never the same. If this story reminded you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest weight, share it with someone who needs to hear that today.